Hello, welcome to the first tutorial series in our making our own programming language. So making your own programming language is extremely fun. I had a lot of fun when I made mine. So let's talk about how we're going to make this work. So we're going to use Python to interpret our language. So we're making an interpreted language, meaning we're not creating a separate file of bytecode or machine code that can be run. So no compiler, just using interpretation, which is slow, but it's a lot easier to implement using a high-level programming language like Python. So the way we would do this, we're going to need to first import this, and then we're going to import everything from this. Now before we go any further, I just want to talk about the syntax we're going to be using in this tutorial. So we're going to be using print for this, at least for this first tutorial. We're going to be using print and then string hello world. You can also add an optional semicolon for a new line if it's just a one-line piece of code. Okay, so let's begin. We're going to need to create a function, and we're going to call this function run. Now this run function will get called at runtime. We're going to call it, and it's just going to do everything for us instead of having all the code inside this run function out there. So we can actually optionally repeat this multiple times if you wanted to. Alright, so let's first set up the calling for this run function, and then we're going to create two functions, one called open file and then parse. So we're going to use data. We're going to create a variable called data, and we're going to set it to the return value of the open file function that we're going to be writing very soon. And then we're going to do print parse. So we're going to create a parse function, and then data. You could return this, then print the return value of run. I'm just going to print it inside my function. So if you've ever actually paid attention to how Python runs a file in Python file, you'll see that they'll have the path of python.exe on your machine, and then they'll put the file. So we're going to do interpreter.py in our case. And then for us, we're also going to pass an extra test.tutorial, which is going to be our file that we're interpreting. So if you were to run this, you would obviously get errors because these aren't defined yet, but this is the main thing. So python.exe is an exe that will run this. So we can turn interpreter.py into an exe if we wanted to, and then we would just do interpreter.exe and then test.tutorial, something like that. So if you to run this, errors, so we're not going to run it, and we're going to just continue creating. That's good. So we need the open file function. So we're going to be using Python to open files, so no extra libraries. We're just going to be using sys, which we already did. So we're going to do def open underscore file, and then we're going to need to pass the file name, which is argv index of 1. So file name, and then we're going to create a new variable called data, not to be confused with this data. This is nested inside run, and then this one has the scope of open file. So we're going to do open, and then we're going to create file name. We're going to use file name, and I'm going to put it in read mode. Then we're going to read all the data. Then we need to return the data to this data variable in our run function. So next we need to parse the data, and this is where it gets a little complicating and maybe a little bit confusing. So I'll do my best to explain everything in the parse function. So let's create parse, and we need to pass file contents into here. We're just going to be calling it file contents because it's descriptive and makes a lot of sense. And this data is what we're going to be passing into it in our script. So we need to first create an empty variable that will be returned when we run this. So it will be returned. So the parse function will return this and then it'll print it. So we're going to do fl equals line string, which stands for file. You could call this file fl, which is easier to type, and I can still understand it. So we're going to do if, and then this is where you start to actually like understand the syntax of the language you're trying to make. So in tester tutorial, you'll see we have print and then a space. Space is crucial, and we're going to make sure that the user who is typing in this programming language keeps that space. So we're going to make sure we do print space in file contents. Now file contents is used and we searching, and then we're going to do fl equals file contents dot replace print space with an empty string. So we're basically essentially just getting rid of this, and now all we have is a string and maybe a semicolon if it's multi-line, and then maybe hi if that's maybe if you formatted your code properly, that would be what you would have remaining. So now we need to replace all the new lines so that our interpreter has less of a job when actually trying to understand our query. So we're gonna do fl equals fl dot replace, and then we're gonna do the new line character. Alright, then we need to replace this with an empty string so that we get rid of all the new lines, essentially just making this that. If it's new line, it's going to be that. So that would be how that would work. So now we need to remove all the quotes from our string that we're inputting to the print function. So we're going to need to do fl equals fl dot replace. So a lot of replacing here. And now we're going to do the quote character, and we're going to replace this with an empty string. This basically making what we have now to be this. So now what we need to do is get rid of the semicolon, or if it's on the same line, get rid of the semicolon and the space, and then replace that with a new line character so that we have this, and then we can just output that. That's basic. It's really, really simple. So what we're gonna do, we're gonna do if colon in fl. So we don't need the space here, because if there's a space, there's gonna be if it's colon space, then colon counts. So now we're going to do if colon space in fl, because we want to check if colon space is there before we check before we replace the colon, because then if we replace the spaces, then we'd get rid of a lot of stuff in the string and there'd be a lot of problems. So now we're going to do fl equals fl dot replace the colon space with new line character. This is simply for printing it out. And then we're going to do else. And now this, if there's only a semicolon, we're going to do fl dot replace colon and then new line. Now you could very easily add an extra condition to this to make sure that if we did this and added a semicolon, now your output would be this plus a new line. You could honestly add a new condition, but I'm not going to do that because I kind of like not having to put a semicolon if it's a single line. So now we need to return our data. We've created fl, this file string, and now we need to return the data that we need to print out. So we're going to do if fl is not none, so we don't want to return nothing if the file is completely empty after we remove everything. So now we're going to just return fl if it's not, and then we can do else. If it is empty, we're going to return empty string, so we return nothing. And with that, you have a fully functional programming language. Quite basic, but it is fully functional. And you can make a lot of modifications to this if you prefer different syntax, a lot of things. So we're just going to run this now. We're going to do python.exe or Python, depending on how your machine is set up. And then you can do interpreter.py, and then you can do test.tutorial. And enter hello world. If I remove the semicolon now, you'll see that it's hello world. Now if I add semicolon and then do hi, and then you can leave the semicolon because it's the last statement. Or you can add the semicolon if you want an extra new line, or if you want something broken. I'll come back right after I fix this issue. Okay, so I have come up with a solution. It's not the best solution, as it does remove some of the functionality, so we can no longer ignore this semicolon. So what we would do is we would do fl equals, actually no, we need to do this in the for loop. We need to do fl equals fl colon -1. So now we're just removing the last character if there's a semicolon. Okay, so now this would automatically imply that this is the last character, and well, at least it still works without that. So since there's no semicolon, it won't do anything. But now if you do print hi without a semicolon, it should remove the I, which would be a problem for most people. Most people would find that problem. So now the semicolon is mandatory in 2-statement code. So at least that fixes something. Alright. So if you're a little bit confused on how this works, you can Google around. You'll definitely find an explanation. So that's it for this video. Thank you for watching. Well, that debugging session was honestly quite a pain. It took much longer than I think it needed to have. Well, thank you. Thanks for watching. Goodbye.